Separating thought and action is really foolish. They work together. And even when we're communicating, we're thinking. Even when we're thinking, we're communicating if we're with another person. And you got to see the unity in that. And you got to see that we have this amazing ability to think. The thing about critical thinking that I think is fascinating is I'm convinced almost everybody can do it.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with John, Chetro, Szivos as we take a communication perspective on critical thinking. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, John Chetro Szivos. John is a former therapist and semi-retired professor. He recently published On Becoming a Critical Thinker, Awakening Your Business Superpower, and is currently working on his next book. John was a student of Vern Cronin's, one of the originators of CMM, at UMass Amherst, and he continues to do work that helps others create better social worlds. This is the third conversation in our series about showing up, as in how are we showing up to each other in our relationships. Showing up could refer to the energy we bring to conversations, the goals we have for our interactions, the assumptions, the stories we tell about ourselves and others, the expectations we have, and the patterns we participate in. Sometimes the ways we show up to each other are unintentional byproducts of other things going on in our lives. Maybe you had a hard day, and so when you get home from work, you show up to your partner with frustration and impatience. But how we show up is also something we can be mindful of and intentional about. For example, maybe you are aware of how you are feeling after a hard day of work and want to be careful not to take out your frustration on your partner. So instead, you do some deep breathing on the way home, decide you want to show up to your partner with love, curiosity, and energy, and make the intentional choice to do so. I'm excited to include this episode as part of our ongoing conversation about showing up because we can't talk about showing up intentionally without addressing the process of engaging in choices, and that requires critical thinking. And critical thinking can feel like one of those buzzwords that you have some idea of what it means, but today John is going to offer us a new perspective on the practice and the embodiment of critical thinking that I think is really valuable. So let's jump in with John. Hi, John. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today.
Well, thank you, Abbie. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm happy you're here too, and really excited to get into your work and connecting it back to communication. To start, introduce yourself. I know that stories is a huge part of communication, so I'd love to ask you to give us some stories so we can start to understand kind of who you are and what led you to do the work that you do.
Sure. Well, I have kind of a strange history, I guess, in some ways. I started off as a therapist and used to work mostly in the psychiatric realm and also substance abuse as well. Foolishly, I moved away from that and got into administration and became a CEO of actually 3 community mental health centers. And the last one was a behavioral health care organization. So I've, run the gamut of small places to much larger, and then did some consulting, but always kept a hand in kind of what was going on intellectually with things. And in fact, it's interesting now I think about it. Some of my introduction to CMM was I was involved in a conversation group at the University of New Hampshire with Sheila McNamee and John Schotter and Jack Glenham, and met a lot of people there and kind of really got the bug to study more. I was in Florida at the time running a behavioral healthcare company, and I could see the writing was on the wall. Managed care was coming in, which I like to call mangled care. And I got to get out of here. I did do some teaching as an adjunct, and I thought, well, maybe I really will pursue the academic route. So I did. Spent a little time at the Fielding Institute and then transferred to UMass Amherst, where I worked most closely with Vern Cronin, who was one of the originators of CMM. And CMM was perfect for me, that I like the notion of stories. I like the notion of what is this thing of communication. And I may have related this to you before about, as a therapist, how one of the people I was treating just was amazed that I helped to change his life, or he changed his own life through words, not chemicals, not behavior programs.
Yeah.
I started to think about what's in the words. And that got me deeper into CMM, deeper into the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and then very deeply into the works of John Dewey, which came from Vern Cronin. And, it's been pretty much, no matter what I look at, it seems like I'm always looking at it through a communication perspective. In fact, just the other day, I just finished a training with 30, I don't know what they were. It was a community college, and it was people in admissions and career services, and all over anything with student services. And they wanted to learn more about circular questioning, it started with. And then we got into what is communication. And we started talking about communication as how we fall into patterns and how to get out of those and how to be helpful with students. And I taught them some of Bateson's going one down when you're serving a student, and remember that we're serving the student to be helpful and we're creating something with them. So I then did become an academic. Unfortunately, I never learned my lesson. I was very happy teaching for about 19 years at a state university, and then I decided to go to a private research school and become a dean, and that was not me. So I went back to teaching at my alma mater for a few years, and now I think of myself as semi-retired. I write and do some lectures here and there and teach a few courses at different schools, mostly in the area of communication. So, yeah, that's where I am right now.
Mm-hmm. That's a great start, and reminds me that this is not a question I ask everybody, but the people that do also have a communication background, I'm always so curious to know. You got into it a little bit there, but what is communication? Like, how do you explain that, what communication is to people?
Yeah, I think it's the life-giving essence of humanness is the way I describe it.
Yeah, I don't think that that's extreme to say. I'm like,
No, I think
it's
it is
all
to others.
communication. I can understand why that's people are like, what are you talking about? But
What are you
to
talking
me,
about?
of course it is.
Well, it's funny because I remember going to National Communication in New York a few years ago, and with a friend, we were on a subway, and we were talking about communication, and some guy, I think he was inebriated. So you guys are getting degrees in communication. What do you get your next degree in? Air? But that's how the world looks at it. When you look
Mm-hmm.
at social sciences, communication is the last. We don't even see a major until 1948.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's something that we do. Abbie, here's one thing I tell people all the time, like, look at the great communication devices we have. You and I are talking over Zoom. We could record this. We could digitize it. We could edit it. We could talk on smartphones. We can do anything. But we're having the same stupid arguments for the last 50,000, 75,000 years. We haven't made any improvements there because we don't understand the impact of our communication. We don't understand what we do with it. We've simplified it to a point of senders and receivers and codes and encodes, and it's so much more than that.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to convince people of that or teach them that is really difficult. And I think maybe there's some hope. People are starting to see that it is much more important. So I think that's why I say it is the life-giving essence of humanness, and it's how we break the chasm of self and other, which is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. That resonates with me because I do also understand that the way a lot of people relate to communication is that it is this abstract kind of intangible thing. But I think that there are ways, and it's like, if you've got a degree in communication, you're familiar with that. There's so many theories and there's so many great tools, and people have, it's that difference between, looking at communication instead of through it that CMM talks about to say, well, what happens if you kind of grasp this, intangible thing in the air and hold it in your hand and try to put a name to it and put language to it. I'm, with you there that language piece is so important.
It could be so many things. When I started my PhD in communication, my 11-year-old daughter said, well, I don't get it. You were going to do a degree in psychology. You'd be a psychologist. If you're doing a degree in communication, you're going to be a weatherman? No. We don't call ourselves communicationists. Actually, the first communication department I worked in, it really was more about production. The emphasis was on making films, making photos, making graphic design. And they just, fortunately for me, and I think for them, that half their courses were in production, half were in theory.
Mm-hmm.
But even at that, it was a battle to sometimes with the other faculty that, what we're teaching is not just how to put a graphic design together.
Yes.
We're trying to relate to people, and it's very difficult for people to see that. Every now and then I'll get a student who just suddenly gets it.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll come to your office and are like, oh, this is everything. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure it's everything, but when I look at my undergrad and most of my work to become a therapist was in the field of psychology, and it's like, and I think of this as a psychology, it's what's going on in here, and sociology, what's going on out there, but communications, what's going on there.
Mm.
And that's where we make things, we make policies, we make nations, we make friendships, relationships. And so it's kind of, when you do catch it, it's like, wow, why
Mm-hmm.
weren't we thinking this years ago? And it's not that new. In CMN and working with Vern, a lot of my influence was Wittgenstein, who saw this, in the philosophical investigations over 100 years ago. And John Dewey in 1925 writes Experience is Nature. And look at chapter 5. The opening line is, of all things, communication is most wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
They were seeing that over 100 years ago. But even when I think about it as a major, the first communication program was, I think, Illinois, and it was for journalists, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't for social scientists yet, really, or
Right.
trying to make meaning in what is meaning. But
Yeah.
I guess we're kind of there. The most exciting thing about CMM, I think, is when Vern and Barnett said it's a constitutive force. Okay, great idea.
Yeah.
But look at what happened in 2000 on with the interpersonal neurobiology movement. They were absolutely on target. The
Mm.
conversations we have changes our neural networks. It changes our brain. And so it is absolutely constitutive, and William James said it back in the 1890s. You want to change your life, change your mind.
Mm.
Um, and it's unfortunate, it's not easy, but when we look at as a constitutive force, it really changes our brain,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the conversations we've had. I do an exercise with students, like, take somebody who's influential in your life, a friend or an adult. What if they weren't in your life? Where would you be now? Or what if that, we all knew, in fact, there was, when I was a little kid, there was a boy up the street who I didn't like hanging around. He seemed a little bit like a bully, and fortunately, I didn't hang around with him. Last I heard, he's doing life in prison. So
Oh my
it's,
gosh.
what if we were best friends?
Mm-hmm.
I might be there with him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those relationships really make us who we are and how we see the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you're getting to this, how we think about things piece, because much of my experience with communication and CMM specifically, which I wonder if it resonates for you too, or the students you teach, is that when I was first sitting in my comm theory classes or my intro to interpersonal communication classes, hearing about these concepts that were new to me in the sense that I had never heard about them in a formal classroom setting before, but it was the experience going on inside of me was less, oh, okay, I'm learning something new. I need to kind of like think about this. And it was more like a recognition of like, oh, I immediately know what that is because I have experienced that. I just didn't have the language for it before. I
Yeah.
wasn't thinking about it in this way. And so that really does take me back to the work that you're doing with critical thinking, because I talk a lot, what I do here, and I talk about it too, is meta communication. We're communicating about how we're communicating. And I think your work is interesting, definitely a piece of that, but on its own, meta thinking, you're thinking about how you're thinking. And that's really valuable to me, because I talk about, what I hope for people with this communication perspective is to really be able to, put it on like it's a pair of glasses and really use it and embody it in ways that
like you're saying, are constitutive and like create these better social worlds because people are empowered in their meaning making and storytelling. And so I think the, predecessor to that is, well, how are you thinking about things before? How are you talking about things and engaging with things? So I'd love to hear more about your critical thinking perspective.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, how the book came about was two things kind of brought it together. One was, having been in higher ed now for a couple decades, I'm kind of amazed how every catalog, there's these hollow words like the student will graduate to become a critical thinker. Okay. Or there's the other one is outcomes assessment. That always gets me, or your learning style. Like, I don't know what those mean. And then I looked at syllabi I wrote and my colleagues wrote, and it's loaded with critical thinking all over it. But no one ever has a discussion with students about what or not many of us have discussions with students about what is critical thinking. And it was fascinating. When I became a dean of this university, we were kind of targeting mid-career professionals who needed a graduate degree. So I decided, well, I'll go out and speak with CEOs in the area of leading companies. I asked them what they needed. And they were telling me, stop teaching technical skills. If you're teaching computers or whatever, it's going to change, or we're using a different system. Teach them how to be better people. Mm. We want the soft skills. And I thought, how many of us can slide through school, get our A's or B's or C's or whatever, and now you're a critical thinker because you have a bachelor's degree. No, you're not.
Oh, you're not.
You don't even know what critical thinking is. And we make bad decisions, or we just don't make any decisions. We don't look at everything. So that was been in the back of my mind for a while. And then about a year ago, I got a call from some biotech company and said, could you teach our managers critical thinking? Yeah, sure. So it made me work with them, and naturally coming from a communication perspective, I had to begin with thinking and thought and interaction and the afterlife of a conversation. And so it really gave me a lot of time into what is critical thinking, how do we learn to do it? For me, CMM is really informed by the American pragmatists, and they have a great statement. I can't remember which one did it, or they all kind of think it. It's not so much what people think is wrong, it's we haven't taught people how to think. And, it's nobody's fault. There's no intrinsic value when there's a misunderstanding as being positive or negative. It's just that it depends on the occurrence, depends on our understanding. And how many times do we not understand things? How many times do we shoot from the hip? Like, oh, I know what that is. And maybe you do, maybe you don't. And so that's what really got me deep into critical thinking and thinking it's, if we are going to in action, this is my Dewey idea, is that separating thought and action is really foolish. They work together. And even when we're communicating, we're thinking. Even when we're thinking, we're communicating, if we're with another person. And you got to see the unity in that. And you got to see that we have this amazing ability to think. The thing about critical thinking that I think is fascinating is I'm convinced almost everybody can do it.
Yeah.
Don't know how or where to start,
right.
Where to begin. I think in the book, I think there's a story in there. I hope it's in there. It's another one I'm writing right now. I was doing a series of lectures in China, and I would do them in this room, and above the room are these beautiful Chinese characters carved in wood. They were over the door, and I asked the interpreters, what does that say? And he said, oh, we call this the Hall of Mental Cultivation. And I thought, wow. I never thought about that. In that I get into quite a bit about how when you become a critical thinker, it's about personal transformation. It's about becoming a different person.
Yeah.
It's becoming more thoughtful, knowing about afterlife, about consequentiality, about what are the antecedents, what are my choices here. And I think that is mental cultivation. I would bet this happened for you. It certainly happened for me. Whenever I've done a degree program, I think it's going to be this, but at the end, I'm so different, and it was something totally different because I don't know what it is to major in this or major in that or get this degree. And then I found so many other things that went on because there was mental cultivation, I guess if you want to call it that. And I'm not sure I like that term altogether, but it does sound.
Sure. It gets at something true, I think,
Yeah,
too.
it's got
And
something
yeah.
beautiful about it that I think only Asian cultures would understand. Wow, we do become a different person by walking in this room and
Mhm.
interacting with thoughts and ideas and people.
Yeah. And there's value in not just taking for granted the way that we think about things, but doing that meta thinking, and really trying to revisit that. And it makes sense to me because it just kind of kills me when people talk about like communication skills, which is a piece of it, but that feels so like shallow, like it's this thing that I just reach for when I need it. Like when people are like, oh, well, make sure you make eye contact when you're giving a presentation. I'm like, but there's something deeper behind that. So that's why I love CMM as like this kind of embodied practice of like, this is a way of being in the world, this communication perspective.
Absolutely.
And like you're saying, I think it changes you at a fundamental level. It seeps into how I think about everything. So I'm like, oh, no, this is not just communication skills, this outside toolbox that you reach into when you need it. It is inside of you, and it is, embodied in the way that you act and think and communicate in the world.
An exercise, I came upon it kind of by accident. I was thinking of stories lived, stories told, and I was thinking about my own personal life. And so I started to write, what are the stories I want to tell in all the different spheres and dimensions of my life? So as a father, as a spouse, as a friend, as a professor, as, you name it. And I started to write the story. And then suddenly that became my roadmap for how I wanted to live. So like, if I'm teaching a summer course, if I want to be a good professor, I'm going to make sure I check in. Are there student emails there today? I mean, it's a beautiful day where I live right now. After a rainy one, cold one yesterday, it'd be great to go out and just take a walk and go have lunch and have a picnic. But if I want to be a good professor, I really have to check in on my 20-something students that were learning some ideas, some very important ideas about a theoretical perspective. And it's like, all right, and I got to think of better ways to get it across to them, and knowing that some are getting it and some probably are not, and some are too shy to say anything. So living the good professor story means I act differently. Or I can say, yeah, I'm a professor. I work really hard, but some days, sometimes,
Yeah.
And I think that becomes an important part. And that is also part of critical thinking too. Who am I? How am I acting is really important.
Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I do want to pause and again ask for a kind of definition from your perspective of what critical thinking is, because I know you have this holistic approach. That's good. That's good, because I think this is the moment to talk about it, because you make that distinction too that I was just making about communication, that you are not approaching it. You're not talking about it as a skill, but as an embodied way of being. And so I think that's different for people, because maybe they're hearing us say critical thinking and they already have an idea in their head about what that is, but it's more of a skill and you're trying to bring to the front something different. So I just want to make sure we have the definition of critical thinking.
Sure. I think I probably changed this definition since I wrote the book, but let me tell you what I did. It's right out of the book. Critical thinking is an intentional activity employing an amalgam of conceptualizing skills and the disposition to engage in the persistent process of questioning, examining, and reflecting on issues, ideas, or concepts. So reflection is key for me. Is that how often do we do that? And the aim is to develop unbiased knowledge through problem solving and reflection. The capacity to interpret is dependent on recognizing the interconnectedness of elements within an existing system and their influence on each other. I'm almost done. I promise. Critical thinking relies on cultivating an open mindset, incorporating thought, feeling, experiences, and action, and a willingness to explore personal assumptions, bias, beliefs, and making sense of what's in my environment. I think we don't look at our environment or our experience enough. And I always use this example. There's a walking trail near where I live, and it's kind of beautiful. It follows along a reservoir. And I live out in New England, so we're very blessed. We have beautiful surroundings here. And normally when I walk on the trail, it's a mile and a half out, a mile and a half back. Where is it? Maybe it's not that much. I walk that much, but I want to get to the end. I want to get back. And I don't know what it was. One day it was a late spring evening, sun's going down and it's setting right over the water. And it kind of caught me how beautiful it was at that moment, how fortunate I was to be there.
Mhm.
And suddenly I looked off to my left and there's a clearing and there was three deer. There was a mother with her little fawns. And I just thought how perfect. And the aesthetic of that and how the moment was kind of for me, kind of consummatory in some ways. But then it hit me, how many times do I not see these things because I'm walking too fast, going
Mhm.
from one end to the other, caught up in okay, I got to walk this, then I got to go home and I got to do this, and I got to do that. And instead of living in that moment, living in that experience, and who knows, those deer may have been there every time I've walked.
Yes, yeah.
Um, or maybe I was lucky and saw them that way. And, I keep thinking of, it's just keep reading about this, how in Japan, when people are not having a good day, they go and sit in nature. And I thought, well, that's kind of curious that we are a part of nature. And
Mhm.
lately I've been, you know, trying to do that, just sit and spend some time in reflection and just appreciating what's around me in that environment. So anyhow,
Mhm.
um, I think critical thinking takes all those things, but you're right. It's metacognition, it's meta communication, is really getting deeper into what we experience and what we do. And the thing that's interesting about it, and I think this is phenomenal, is that much like understanding communication or becoming a critical thinker, or I'm not sure they're that different, um, we have to practice at it. And the most
Yeah.
difficult thing is, you know, um, one of my hobbies is I play music. I have drills for me to play better, play faster, play clearer, play cleaner. When I was younger, I played a sport and I had a coach telling me what to do. But probably the most important thing I have to do is think. And no one's given me any practice in that. And no
Mhm.
one gives me much feedback. All I see is what could happen.
Yeah.
Um, and uh, and I keep thinking how critical practice is. And so when I teach critical thinking, or do a seminar or something, there's so many opportunities to do this. Is like,
Mhm.
okay, what are all the possibilities? Well, I'm sorry I keep quoting Dewey, but I think he channels through me. Or I'd be fortunate if he did. He actually said intelligence is the ability to take a situation, look at all the possible things that went on, and what is my preferred consequence? That's critical thinking.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so, later today, I do have to check in on my students. I do want to spend time with my wife. I actually have a meeting that I have to go to with a financial planner. Um, but I really have to think about all of those. What do I want to create at the end of that?
Mm.
Um, where do I want to have the best story at the end? Um, and I think that is practicing it all the time. And like, did I do that? Did I present the best self? Did I listen? Was I present? Um, and so I think that's part of critical thinking. And I think we have to come back and reflect on it. It's
Yeah.
interesting is that one of the things I find, it seems why this was done in the military more than any other places, lessons learned after a mission, they come back and talk about things that went well, things that did not
Mhm.
go well. How many of us do that with our lives? Either we, out of embarrassment, stuff it away or just think like, well, it's the other person's problem.
Mhm.
Um, but how could I have been different in that? So I'm doing too much talking.
No,
So,
that's great. And it the language it mirrors so obviously to me the language of better social worlds and
yeah,
CMM. And so I'm glad for you to be able to put this language to it because I've been talking about better social worlds in all my conversations in one way or another. And I've talked about it as this kind of practice in, thinking about better social worlds, taking a moment to reflect and say, what does that mean to me? What does a better social world
yeah,
look like to me? And how would I act now if I'm getting there? And the thing I haven't said, because I haven't had the language for it like you're giving me now, is that what that process is or what is needed in order to do that process is critical thinking. I
yeah.
won't
In
say
fact,
skills, but a practice, embodiment of it.
yeah. In reflecting
Yeah.
on what goes on, it's
Mhm.
interesting. Years ago, I don't have time to do it anymore. I used to play golf and I enjoyed it, and it's beautiful. You're outside, and You meet some nice people. But it was kind of funny that when I thought about it, how many of us just stayed at the same level because we didn't practice. We would go
Hmm.
down the course and whack the ball, walk around, but I never spent time on the driving range or the putting range, or I think I took one lesson. I mean, I got
Yeah.
about a little better than average, maybe,
Yeah.
but it never hit me that if I really wanted to enjoy that, I should be doing practice and not
Mhm.
just playing it. And there are drills, and there are things like I said with music, and it takes time.
Yeah.
How many people go out? I think I mentioned that in the book. They love music and they love it so much they go out and they buy a guitar and they bang on it and nothing's coming out,
Yeah.
and they give up. And meanwhile they're learning two things. They're learning musical timing and they're learning the instrument, and that's two very different things, and it's very
Hmm.
frustrating.
Hmm.
But no one is, well, maybe there are people there for practice, but it's just not that rewarding yet unless
You're right.
you have that deep desire to keep going with it. And it's funny because as a musician, I don't really play with people anymore. I really enjoy practice now.
Mhm.
Um, I do it with a metronome. I know what I'm going to practice. I really don't care if I play with anybody again. I mean, I hope I do, but
Yeah.
it's just I love the instrument, the look of it, the sound of it, the smell of it, the feel of it, and it's like that's practice.
Hmm.
That if I do have to perform, yeah, it's only going to come about because of practice, um,
Hmm.
and not performance.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to the story you shared about your walk, and I really like that as a metaphor for what critical thinking practice is
Hmm.
that it is you're on a path, and where critical thinking intervenes in that is you looking up, pausing on your path, looking around, and noticing things you weren't noticing if you were solely focused on looking at your feet walking on the path that's
Or just
familiar
getting
to
to
you
the
and that
end.
you know, just getting to the end of the path. But critical thinking is that coming in and slowing down in a sense, I would say, kind of that like difference between like reacting and responding is something I've talked about with people before. And so that pause almost of
Yeah,
critical thinking being an intentional thing that you're saying is a practice. And it's like working out, like building a muscle up
it
almost, that
really
it's like
is.
you might not currently have a practice in catching yourself on the path. Your current practice might be getting to the destination and following the sidewalk that's been, laid out for you. But if you can start flexing that muscle of looking around, then I would think it just becomes, easier and easier to do so.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think you capture exactly what I'm talking about. Is that it sounds so time consuming.
Hmm.
What else do we have to do?
Yeah.
Uh, I just don't get it. When you look at journaling or meditating or praying, they're so necessary in life. I always think of if you read the play Macbeth, his problem, if you actually get to see it performed or can follow it closely enough through the language, he's never alone. He never gets a chance to think. He gets
Mm,
to others. Um,
yeah.
and it's like you have to be alone. You have to think. That's
Yeah.
part of who we are.
Mhm.
And I'm glad more people are latching onto mindfulness and journaling and gratitudes and all these kind of exciting things. They're the start of being more thoughtful
Mhm.
um, and more intentional in what we do. And it's interesting. I'm kind of laughing because I just thought of an interpersonal class I had years ago, and the thing was it was a small thing like describe your perfect day. And this one young woman caught it. She said, what my perfect day is? I wake up and have a great breakfast. I have some time to do a little exercise, write in my journal. And then at lunch, I meet a friend. And from lunch till about 7 or 8 o'clock, I'm with people. And from 8 o'clock until lunch next day, I'm alone to make sense of it. And I thought, wow.
Wow.
That's
Yeah.
individuality and sociality coming together
Yeah.
um,
In a complementary way rather
in a
than a
complementary way, right?
contradictory way.
Yeah, and then not that I'm lonely or
Hmm.
that I need to be at wild, crazy parties every night, that I need both. Well, I don't know if I need wild, crazy parties, but
Sure.
I need friendship and companionship to make sense of things. I need time to think about it. I need time to be me,
Mm.
and relax with me. And I think that's super important. And I think it's just a great way of looking at a perfect day.
Yeah. I don't think many people would have included time for reflection in their perfect
No,
day.
it really was funny. And actually, she was an incredible student. She did something funny. Was I'm kind of laughing because the student had a lot of health problems that semester, and she just looked sad. And she said, "Everybody, reach in your backpack. Let's give something to Nancy. It's got to be worth at least 50 cents." People threw in quarters, and some threw in a pen or a pencil. And that was part of her thing. A perfect day would be getting gifts all day long. So Nancy got a gift. And then we did it
Right.
once a week. We'd have to
Oh,
bring something, and some kids would bring ramen noodles or cookies
oh,
and draw a name, and you got the present.
oh,
But it was a way of kind of celebrating that, kind
yeah.
of connection. It was really kind of neat.
My orientation in this podcast is toward making things practical for people.
Right.
Still, for me, rooted in what I think is a really rich theory around communication. Now, I don't want to lose sight of, the theory foundation of it, but it was really for me sitting in my communication classes saying, why is this not available to everyone? Why am I not hearing about this? Why do I have to get a degree in communication to have, become familiar with these things? So again, to me, accessibility, making it practical for people in our real lives. And so, you talked about the organization that asked you to come teach critical thinking. We've kind of covered like, okay, what is it? But I'm curious about how you do critical thinking. Like we've talked about it kind of broadly as a practice, but I wonder, and maybe you have a story about a time you have taught it to someone or you have some language that you use. But yeah, I'm just curious about taking that step further to making it a practical practice. If you can break down for people what it actually looks like.
Yeah, one of them, I think, Daniel Kahneman wrote a book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And he does, you probably have seen this, it's, a bat and ball together cost $1.10, and the bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Well, everybody's going to make the wrong answer. So obviously the bat's got to be $1.05, and the bat's got to be, or the ball rather, is going to be 5 cents, but most people go to the 10.
Yeah.
So I start with that, and then I kind of show how thinking kind of does it. And I always tell the story. A few years ago, I sold my house, and when it went on the market, I looked around, and there were 3 or 4 other houses that were same square footage, very similar kind of houses, and they were all set at one price. And the realtor came and said, "Well, let's do the same price they had." And I was, "No, I want to be 20,000 less." What? You can get 20,000 more. Well, reading Kahneman's book, I knew I got an idea that I said, "Could we do the open house? Because 2 of them are going to have open house that same day. People are likely to go to all 3 houses."
Definitely.
They saw mine 20,000 less. They got into a bidding war, and I got the exact price the realtor said.
Yeah.
In the other houses, I noticed actually one of them sold for much less, and I couldn't get rid of it. And so I think that's just shows you a little bit of how people kind of think in a wacky kind of way. Some of the other work I really like is Ronald Heifetz, and he does the difference between a technical and an adaptive problem. So along my journey, I did an MBA degree, and I learned a lot of technical skills, and they didn't work.
Okay.
I went to an executives program, so I'd go to school on weekends and come back, and I still have the same employees, the same problems, and I try to apply what I learned in the textbook, and it didn't fit. And then I started to realize when I read Heifetz's work is that I don't deal in many technical problems. I deal in more adaptive problems. Technical problems are relatively easy. We know how to go about doing it. If I'm going to, I don't know, yesterday I had to put up a post to support something out in my yard. Well, you go out, buy a post, and you get a sledgehammer, and you bang it into the ground, and you fasten the thing to it, and we're done. But most of the problems in my life that I've had trouble with are adaptive problems. Look at society, racism. We don't know how to solve that. We don't know how to solve things that require much more thought, much more adaptation, different perspectives of what goes on. And unfortunately, we teach a lot of technical skills to people, and they're wonderful, and sometimes they work. I hope that next time I go to a doctor, I have a health thing. He uses his technical skills um, to resolve it. But when I look at people whose marriages are falling apart, people who don't know where their life is going, those are adaptive problems. They're not technical problems.
Mhm.
And like you said, with communication, we want to teach it as skills, as technical skills. No,
Yeah.
it's about adaptation,
Yeah.
um, and until we learn how to think in adaptive ways, and learning to think adaptively means I work with others, I collaborate. What's your thought? What's your idea? I try things. I talk to the person I'm having the problem with, possibly. Who knows what it is? Um, and I look at how do I slowly adapt to it, or hopefully quickly, but usually it's going to be a series of steps to adapt to what's going on. And I think we just keep looking for the quick technical solution.
Mhm.
And some things do work technically, but
Yeah.
not everything.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's such a great distinction to make. And I like that you're taking it to this broad level of like the example of as a society, how do we solve or address issues like racism that are, like you're saying, not technical problems,
Yeah.
there's not a handbook saying, do this if no troubleshooting in that kind of sense.
Yeah, we did
Yeah.
all the technical things. We
Yeah.
passed civil rights laws. We ended
Right. Right.
segregation. We had affirmative action for a while. We tried to be inclusive, but it hasn't solved things. They're a
Right.
little better.
Hmm.
But until we really talk about what racism is and why it
Hmm.
exists, when
Yeah.
you look at it, how foolish it almost seems. If you look at old periods, I've been watching this series. I think it was a masterpiece, Islands at War, and it's about Germans take over this English island, and they're trying to convince the people on the island that Jews are evil. It's they're showing these goofy films. See, it's historically accurate. Um, but so many of us have moved on. Hopefully that
Yeah.
Jews are evil. And it's like, wow. So
Yeah.
in 1930s, 1940s, people really believe this. And how did they get there? Um, I don't know, but we don't seem to think of things in that way. So,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm feeling like, again, my love is interpersonal communication, that really truly like what's going on between each of us. But I know, like, again, the subtitle of your book, at least, is that it is a business superpower, even. So I'm curious if we can keep talking about that kind of expanded perspective on critical
sure.
thinking of not only what we've already talked about, how it can change us, how it can change our interpersonal relationships, but on a larger scale, what can it do for us in our social worlds?
Yeah, superpower was just to get it catchy. And actually,
Uh-huh.
I talk about it. I was teaching a student, a graduate student. Um, it was critical thinking, but it was using circular questioning.
Hmm.
And she actually got quite good at it. And so one day she came to me and said, "Oh, I just used this with such and such." It's like a superpower.
Yeah.
um, it kind of is. And it's not that we're going to be superheroes, but that it does have an ability to
Hmm.
change the way we see in things. And
Yep.
yes, I guess it is a superpower. I think just about every human being has the capacity to do this.
Hmm.
Um, but we don't. We rely on technical solutions, or we just think too fast, or like my walk, I got to get to the end, then I got to get to the beginning. Um,
Hmm.
instead of experiencing what's there, and we really see it. In fact, I asked a student a question the other day. He was saying he's lost. He doesn't know what he's doing, doesn't know what to major, doesn't know what to do, and how frustrating it is. And he's in college because his parents want him. He's first generation. They want him to be
Hmm.
the first, but they don't know what it is. And I just feel lost. So we talked about loss for a little while, and then I came up with the question of all stories have a beginning and an ending. What's the ending of the lost story? And he even stopped and said, "Thanks. That's a great question." I don't know
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
came to mind, but or how I even came up to it, but it was superpower-ish.
Right.
Um, and he said, "I have to create the end of the story." And then, wow.
Wow.
Yeah, you got more than I did on that. But and I think that's not that I got it. It's what he must have thought of when I asked that question.
Hmm.
That, yeah, stories do have an end. I'm not going to be lost forever.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's a superpower when we learn to ask ourselves those questions. And if you do enough questioning like that with a student, or you do enough, you show them to think critically, they don't need you anymore.
Right.
They now have the power to go off and do it on their own. And that's a really strange feeling. I did a training on critical thinking for a student I had as an undergrad and a grad, and she's now the executive director of a veterans outreach center that's doing fantastic work.
Wow.
And and I'm kind of looking at her, and she's just done a great job and just been nominated to the state board on veterans outreach and all this. I thought, well, I couldn't have done that. Now I'm starting to see students doing more than I ever did.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, that's great. At first it was like, gee,
Yeah. Yeah.
feeling bad for me. But it's wonderful to think that I had some small part in all of that.
Yeah. Talk about the collaborative, creative force of communication.
Exactly. And it's just really amazing. So yeah, that's important. You were mentioning social worlds, and the one part I always like, I teach students is the 2 H's, 2 W's. The 4 questions that Barnard has: what are we making, and how are we making, and what are we becoming, and how do we make it better? Those questions are fantastic. And I think everybody should be asking that in their relationships, their work. I do it routinely in my marriage. I have a very good marriage, I think, because of those questions.
Yeah.
What are we doing, and how are we doing this, and what are we becoming? And it's really that those are critical thinking questions. You're
Definitely.
And they're so simple for people to keep in their mind. Like, remember the 2 W's, 2 H's. That's what I always tell them.
Yeah, that you're making me think of an idea that really sticks with me from John Burnham, who's been on this podcast and also, therapist practicing CMM, of changing the moment in the moment.
Yep.
And to me, that if you're like, okay, well, why critical thinker? What does critical thinking do? It gives you the opportunity to change the moment in the moment. And I love the word intentionality. I like being purposeful and mindful. I think all kind of interrelate in their own ways. I think that's really beautiful to say that you can ask those 4 questions.
You really can.
Think forward. Think forward to your better social world, and then work backwards. And you get to be intentional, and you get to change the moment in the moment. And to me, that's so empowering, right? That choice piece that's in CMM. I think that's really beautiful when people can embrace that and understand that to be true, because maybe you've never been told that before. So you think things just are the way they are. And then also when you can feel equipped to make new meaning, tell new stories, make change happen, as a critical thinker, really.
The other thing, and I think of John Parrish-Sproull, who's out at IUPUI, and John teaches his students that you have a choice. There's always a choice in everything. And I think that when you can combine that simple message with critical thinking is, all right, let's think through my choices here. I wish they were immediate. I wish we knew what to do right away, but we don't. And we have to see that. It's interesting. One of the parts of the book that, some people will say, well, is it a communication book? And actually I call it a business book, and it's not really a business book. I mean, there's a chapter or 2 in there about some tools business people use to help you think, but I think it applies to everybody. But I start to talk a lot about joint action and interdependence. And I don't think we understand that. When I have a conversation, I don't own it. You don't own it. We created it together.
Right.
And, the exercise I love to use with people, and they have fun with it, is I ask people to draw a picture together, but they can't talk. And so if I made a line like that, you'd have to do something to touch my line to move it out.
Yeah.
But it's got to be a coherent picture. It can't just be the abstract thing that you color in. So sometimes you get pictures that are scripted, like talking about the weather. Well, I draw a picture of a house and a tree and a person, or an island and a boat. Sometimes they're incredibly silly, and sometimes they're really beautiful. But people get the idea of how difficult it is to really coordinate our actions with others, and that 2 good drawers know how to work off each other's thing. It kind of reminds me, I did some research a few years ago on awkward moments. We have a moment in conversation it's not really embarrassing. Embarrassment might be there, but it's just awkward. We don't know what to say. Someone says something, is like, what? Where did that come from? Well, it was interesting because one of the students that was one of the people that was working on that was a student of Vern's, and she was an improvisational actor. And
Mm-hmm.
she was talking about, to be a good improvisational actor, you have to look for openings or create openings for others.
Mm.
And I think that's so much like conversation, that we have to keep them. And, you look at conversations and triads, and, if you said to me, oh, I don't feel great, and I were to say, not me, I feel wonderful. Well, there's no third talk turn. It makes sense.
Yeah.
But if you were to say you don't feel well, and I said, oh, what's wrong? What are some of your symptoms? What do you think it could be? Or how could I help? We have a conversation now.
Yeah.
We created an opening. And I think that is so much about joint action, and so much about interdependence is in that. So we have to go on from there. And actually, I do talk about that. That's a critical part of, especially for business people, is that you're working in collaborative teams.
Right.
Supposedly, I think teams is the most misused word ever.
Mm-hmm.
But we're a team. No, you're not. You're just a cluster of people working in the same place. You're not a team until you know how to work with each other.
Yes.
And there's a big difference between a group and a team, but that happens.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I like this element of that this is something that applies to interpersonal communication and organizational communication, because what are organizations if, like you're saying, not just a bunch of individuals trying to come together and collaborating? And so the same principles apply, and this hopefully can be really scaled up. And so critical thinking can have bigger implications. I mean, it's still huge, to change individual people's lives and their quality of life, but also beyond that for like societies and communities to really engage it on that bigger level, like you're talking about.
Well, you look at people on the food chain, we were probably somewhere in the middle, the beginning of time, but because we could use our brain and think, if there's a woolly mammoth outside that wants to eat us, a bunch of us could get together and say, okay, we could do this and this and this. And that's what working in an organization or a community of any kind is think about what is a meeting other than people sitting around and having communication. But how many meetings did I go to in my life where, half the people are zoned out or drawing pictures, or now with electronic technology, checking their email, and not making the most of, let's collaborate and make this the best we can. And I think that's when we start giving up our human capacity to actually do things better and do it well.
Yeah. Well, John, I really appreciate that. And as we're kind of wrapping up, I want to just throw it back to you and have a wide open invitation of what else, what is there anything that we haven't touched on today about critical thinking, communication, any of it that you want to talk about?
Yeah, the one we didn't touch on in the book that people absolutely love is the triune brain. And it somehow it explains a lot to people, is that if you look at in the 1960s, I can't remember who did this, someone came up with this concept, the triune brain, that actually what we have is a kludge. The kludge is an old naval word for a workaround. Our brains are not well done. We have three brains. You've got the primitive brain, and you've got the mammalian brain, and then you've got this neocortex. And they're not well connected. And sometimes one takes over on the other. And part of thinking is, which brain am I thinking with? I found people grab on that really fast, is that, if someone gets me angry and I want to respond, I might go to the primitive brain, like, don't you talk to me that way. And it's not going to get me anywhere positive. And so many times I know in my own personal relationships, like, use your new brain, use your new brain. That's my mantra now. And people really like that. And I think it explains to them a lot of why this is difficult and can be easier, is when you understand that your brain is, I want to believe that we come back 10, 20,000 years from now, the brain will be better through an evolutionary process. But right now it's a kind of a messy connection of three pieces that sometimes override each other. And I think that's what also happens in critical thinking, in our interaction with others. So I think that's been something people have really grasped onto, which I didn't think would be that big of a deal, but it gives them some reason for it. So I guess my thing is with critical thinking is practice. Every time we're about to make a decision, every time we're about to enter into a day, it's really important to do that reflection of what do I want this to be, and what can I make with it? And then if you're bold enough, take the step to look at the other person and ask the two W and two H questions, what are we making and how? I think that could probably save a lot of marriages. Couples could learn to do that, or friendships for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful note to end on, I think. And I appreciate you making it really, really tangible and adding that. I think this conversation is going to forever inform how I'm thinking about the communication perspective itself too. So not just, this kind of, again, inception of I'm taking a communication perspective on critical thinking, but also critical thinking is fundamental to that communication perspective in the first place. So it's got that interesting relationship.
There's a unity for sure, and I keep thinking of, again, the work of Dewey, where he said, if you look at thought and action, there's a unity there. Thought, action, experience, they're not separate, and we tend to separate them all the time. And it's just a foolish thing when we do in breaking it down. So, yeah, I think it is holistic in its nature, and we have to think more in that way in terms of holism. But it's hard.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, John, thank you so much for your time and this conversation today.
Yeah, great talking to you, great meeting you, and maybe we'll do it again. I have another book coming out.
Absolutely. Perfect.
Speak
Wonderful.
Like a Leader is the next one.
Great. We'll follow up for sure. That's perfect.
Yeah, I'm working on that now. It's going slowly, though.
Sure.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with John. At the end of each episode, I like to offer questions to reflect on, which act as next turns so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, the questions I would have you think about are, where in your life can you practice critical thinking? And how can you think critically about your communication? You can reach out to me to share your reflections to these questions, as well as any of your own questions or ideas. And you can do that through email, the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. Links to all those places are in the show notes, so you can find them easily. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue with each other. Other great ways to stay in dialogue are to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, which I greatly appreciate, and most importantly to me, share this episode or any other episode that's been meaningful with someone that you want to invite into this conversation as well. I'm supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward better social worlds. The CMM Institute is now on Substack. You can check that out at www.cmminstitute.substack.com. And there you'll find a bunch of really helpful resources, including this podcast, but also some other short videos, as well as infographics that I've made. So if you are curious about learning more about CMM and the foundation of this theory, then those are going to be great resources for you. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and all the other initiatives at all the links I've provided in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.